And I believe we're good to go. All right, we'll have a word of prayer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Olivia for today's report. All right, let's pray. Thank you, Father, for bringing us back together again today. And thank you for the message in chapel and the reminder about honor shame cultures that fits into what we've been looking at throughout the semester. Thank you for these students, and I pray that as they take exams, finish up classes, that you would be greatly honored to give them the ability to recall and to complete everything so that they can go home and enjoy a time of reprieve, change of pace here in the middle of the semester. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, Olivia, I'm going to give you this so that you can use the microphone there. Go ahead with your report.
All right. Well, at this point, I don't really know which side I'd rather be on, giving this presentation or listening to this presentation, so bear with me. So I did my report on the Viable Missionary, Learner, Trader, Storyteller by Donald Larson. And just a couple quotes that I wrote down from this. It says, the wide gap in the missionary's conception of his role and how it is viewed by the non-Christians of his adopted community. And then it says, this gap between missionaries and non-Christians and their local communities generates communication problems of many different kinds. So basically what this is about is trying to discuss whether or not a missionary can evaluate his viability, and viable meaning just capable of working successfully or feasible. And so he starts by explaining that obviously when a missionary goes into a new community or culture, the locals view him as an outsider. And it also says, outsiders cannot live on the edge of a community without coming to the attention of insiders in a negative way. The term outsider has negative connotations. And so how he describes it is locals view missionaries or newcomers in like 3 different backdrops. And those are the schoolhouse, the marketplace, and the courtroom. And with the schoolhouse backdrop, they view missionaries as the teacher, themselves as a student, and then the purpose of the encounter, in their opinion, is for the missionary teacher to transmit information to be learned. In the marketplace backdrop, they see the missionary as a seller, the local as a buyer, and the purpose of their encounter to buy and sell something. And then the courtroom, they see the missionary as an accuser, the local as the accused, and the purpose of the encounter is for judgment. And the locals really use these 3 backdrops to decide the value or viability of the missionary and his message. They basically ask themselves, do I need to learn what the missionary has to teach? Do I need to buy what the merchant has to sell? And do I need to take the accusation seriously? The locals may expect the outsider to understand them and their culture before the missionary can expect himself to be able to effectively teach, sell, or accuse. And so the missionary's main concern should be to be a student before he is a teacher, a buyer before he's a seller, and to be accused before he's an accuser. So basically, the outsider, in order to get on the inside, has to become an insider. Otherwise, the gap between the missionary and the locals will remain until the missionary is seen as viable. So closing the gap, it says to close the gap typically means that the missionaries will have to measure their effectiveness by the standards of their hosts, not their own. Inevitably, the missionary comes to realize that he or she must first be acceptable by local standards, and to be acceptable, local community members must first find them teachable. And then so he describes there are 3 roles that a missionary can seek to establish to gain viability. And those three are learner instead of teacher, trader instead of seller, and storyteller instead of accuser. And the methods to closing this gap are to, he explains, to build on those three, the learner, trader, storyteller, by first, he recommends starting with the skill or attribute that you find to be the most important to learn. And then he says to add a new skill in a certain allotted amount of time, and he recommends like 3 months. And then you just keep building on new skills while you're still working on past ones. So for an example, to begin, he recommends to start as a learner, and he recommends to do this role to start with language. So what he explained was that for 3 months, he would recommend meeting with your language teacher and just kind of building on that skill. And then he says, I try to communicate on their terms. So he's trying to build a connection with the people by first being able to communicate effectively. In doing so, he's making acquaintances, he's starting to build relationships. He's able to then, after his lessons, go out and initiate conversations with locals. And then he says that in doing so, you can start to experience some at-homeness with the new community. So then after 3 months of really working on the language and being able to initiate conversations with people, being able to answer basic questions and everything, after 3 months, he went on to the trader role. And then again, as he's developing the new role, he's still working on language. So he's picked up a new one and he's still working on the initial one. So he says to add the role of trader to learner, and then to the locals, your motives begin to make sense. You can then start to trade experience and insight with the locals. And then present yourself as part of humankind and not as an alien by exchanging elements of your background. So being able to start discussion with the locals and being able to trade information, answer questions, and kind of discuss the outside world as well. Concentrate on fitting in and establishing relationships. And then you are obviously, again, continuing to build on your knowledge of the language. And ultimately, you're showing that you are someone who is interested in other people and seeks to trade information. You're not just interested in yourself and what you have to say. And then after 3 months, he added on the role of storyteller. And then obviously, again, you're building on the other ones as well. And he says to learn to tell a simple story by meeting with your language helpers. So you're still working on language. And then try to practice stories based on biblical principles in stories. And then go out into the community in the afternoon and be able to start sharing the gospel and telling biblical stories. And then you can build on your positive influence on learner and trader. And then he said, after you do those 3 main things, you just continue to build in new roles where you see fit. And then he says, after you've done so, then you can revisit your viability. And it says the viability matters in 3 areas: the new community, in 4 areas. Ultimately, you are analyzing your viability not only in the new community, but you're also analyzing your viability to other missionaries that work there, the agency that sent you, and to yourself. So in conclusion, locals obviously are naturally curious about outsiders, and it will really help if you are an outsider who shows himself to be ready and willing to learn. Uh, in doing so, you will be better accepted into the community. It says effective missionaries enjoy learning, and most sending agencies focus viability measured by the storyteller position, but he explains that he believes that the other roles are just as important. It's not just about, uh, obviously it is about sharing the gospel and everything, but you need to focus on building those relationships and building that trust, because if you don't have those, then they're not even going to be willing to listen to what you have to say. Um, yeah, and sorry, the learner is just as important as the storyteller, because it's showing the locals a sense of vulnerability, and it's showing that you don't claim to know everything. You're not coming across as arrogant or ignorant in a new community that you aren't familiar with. You don't want to come across that way. And they don't want to see you that way. They don't want you to think that you know about their culture and about um, their area when you don't, because you aren't from there. And then the trader role is just as important as well, because it complements the more formal presentation of the gospel through sharing of essentially secular knowledge about peoples of the world. And he says that Christians probably have a wider understanding of human variation than any other group of people, simply because of our multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multilingual diversity. So the importance of it all, he said, as the colonialism continues to wane and as the strength of maturing national churches continue to grow, missionaries are becoming more and more frustrated as the viability of their role is questioned. So he suggests that roles need to be added and modified if missionaries are expected to continue. So you can't just expect all the missionaries and all the missionaries to come to have just the storyteller role underneath their belt. You need to be open to adding roles and kind of modifying yourself to be able to fit into those other communities. And then lastly, he ended with a story that he told. Well, he was at a missions conference, and a lady came up to him, and she said, she asked him if he knew anything about elephants, and he was like, no, like, why is that important? And she explained to him, she was like, well, when a herd of elephants goes up to a watering hole, if there is already a separate herd there, what the leader of that second herd does is they back up into the watering holes. So the one leader goes back first, and he goes toward the watering hole until he's stopped by the feel of the other elephants from the first herd touching him. And what he does is he stands there and he waits until he can feel the other elephants separating, to where he can back up into the watering hole, and then that gives a sign to his herd that the first herd is making room for them. Sorry if that didn't make sense, but basically what uh, after she explained that, he was like, okay, and like, um, but she explained it. She said, I think a lot of missionaries try to go into cultures head first. They try to force their way into, another herd, so to speak, um, when we should be trying to go in back first and wait for that community to open up for us instead of just forcing our way through there.
selling or trading, and then the courtroom one, yeah, the idea of accusing. And there's a logical order to that. You're not going to want to buy into something that you know nothing about, so there has to be a learning time going on. But before you can teach as a newcomer, you need to demonstrate that you are willing to learn from them. That's really good, which means the missionary enterprise takes time. Time is a big deal in this. And so how do you do that if you go on a short-term trip? You only have a couple weeks. Well, if you're going on a short-term trip, you're probably working alongside a veteran missionary who has already passed through that process. So you're, in a sense, standing on his shoulders. He's already gained the respect and won the people so that when you come to do a short-term trip, you have the advantage of all that he's done in preparation in winning the people. And if he hasn't done that, then your experience as a short-termer probably isn't going to make a big impact because you're really going on his shoulders. Good, that is very interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. Obviously, when it comes to trading, we're not talking about what some missiologists talk about when they say we need to sit down at the table and just exchange ideas with other religions or other groups. That we do not have a biblical warrant to do. But trading ideas, learning from them so that you earn the right to share the gospel of Christ with them. There's a lot of good stuff there. All right, well, thank you, Olivia. I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, I am just going to finish up something from the last time. Let me just pull this up, and then we'll move on to the last one. Okay, well, we got to share the screen here. Hang on. Let me get the screen sharing going here. And I want that one, and we're sharing. Okay, so we're talking about neutral and affective cultures last time, right? The idea of expression. And you know, you've probably experienced this. If I get on an airplane heading to Brazil, the Americans are going to sound like the quiet ones, and the Brazilians are going to be, you know, laughing, having a great time, and they might even be leaning up on, after the plane gets up to 10,000 feet and they can get out of their seats. Someone might even be leaning against your chair, you know, and I'm thinking, hey, wait a minute, this is my seat, you know, but, you know, their space, concept of space is very different. You know, but if I get on an airplane going to Tokyo, all of a sudden it's the other way around. It's the Americans who seem to be the loud, boisterous ones because the Japanese are very, very polite, very quiet for most of the flight. So that was kind of the idea here, using the. Have you ever had that happen? Get on, you're going to another place, and you know, you're either the loud, boisterous ones or you're the quiet ones, depending on. How about in Guam when I know there are different ethnicities there, but is there a tendency one way or the other when you're in a flight with? It'll be noisier. Interesting. Yep. All right. And then this is something that we're not going to do today, but if you had time in a class, you want to do something kind of creative, you could actually talk about God and the way he expresses himself. Is God affective or neutral? How do you read Bible verses that record God's voice or an angelic message? Now, some of you are, you know, a little more dynamic when you read, others you maybe not so much. But even when it comes to reading and expositing the Bible, this is an interesting question. Does God adapt his voice to the culture to whom he is communicating? How much does God reveal his emotions to us? This is not in your notes, this is just extra stuff, okay? For instance, if you were gonna read this passage, you know, would you say, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves on the earth, and God said, as if everything was the same tone. I would strongly encourage you to fight against that tendency, okay? I'm not an expert reader, but I would encourage, you know, something a little more like, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Now, do I know how God was actually talking? No, I don't. But I am making a clear distinction between the narration and the actual words that are recorded of God. And I would encourage you to do that. That's just an exercise. There's another passage. When it comes to the warning, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. That's the very first warning ever given in the Bible. How would that have come across to Adam and Eve? And then, of course, what happens after the fall? So just curious, you know, when you're teaching or preaching the Word of God, try to imagine what even something like a tone of voice in the Scripture would have sounded like, and do your best to imitate it. So we're going to switch now to the final cultural dimension or value, which is called tight versus loose. Okay? That's not referring specifically to clothing, although it involves it. And it's not referring to finances being a tightwad or being loose with your money, although it may involve that as well. But let's see what we're talking about here. So, social norms. We're talking about how strict customs are in certain cultures. Oh, and by the way, my wife keeps reminding me that I don't send the attendance sheet around until I try to remember who was there. And if I'm not sure, then the person gets counted present, because I can't mark somebody absent if I'm not totally sure they weren't there. So if you just mark today's date, just check mark for being present. Okay, now on your notes, you'll notice I have tight versus loose, right? But on here, I'm going to use an alternate way of describing it, and they're both correct. It's just a different way. Some would prefer the words restraint versus indulgence. So does a culture emphasize restraint when it comes to variety in the way people dress or act or speak? Or does it encourage indulgence? Letting people be who they are individually. So the restraint idea would be a little bit more of the collectivistic idea where we all want to kind of look and sound and act alike. And the indulgent one is more the individualistic idea of letting people be whoever they are. All right? So, main idea, number one in your notes, how you handle people who deviate from cultural norms. Now, we're not talking about devious people here, okay? A little different use of the word. How people deviate from cultural norms. In other words, if in your culture, you pretty much know where you live, how far you can take certain things, right? I mean, even if you look at the dress code here at Faith, you're accustomed enough to the culture here that you know pretty much what the limits are, okay? When you walk into church, the culture of your church, you pretty much know what the parameters are as far as your volume of your voice, what kinds of things you talk about. You don't have to even think about that. Olivia, one of the things that came to mind in your article, and I think we've talked about this, do you remember us talking about the difference between emic and etic? So tell me what it is. What's emic refer to? Yeah, emic is referring to people who actually live in the culture, their view of their own culture. And then etic then would be people looking from the outside, right? And actually, both of them are necessary in order to really understand a culture. Those of us who have grown up in an American culture really don't know our culture as well as we might think. In fact, there may be somebody who comes from the outside and says something that we've been totally oblivious to. And so that outside perspective is also necessary. All right, I'm going to move these before I end up falling. I didn't fall off the table. It would be really embarrassing to fall off a little chair and break my neck. Okay. So again, this part is not in your notes, but just a little extra. What are social norms? Well, according to patheos.com, implicit or explicit rules that constrain behavior without the force of laws. Now, laws can be used to manipulate people. But so the real question when it comes to how tight or loose a culture is how free are they without the constraint of laws? So let's suppose, for example, that we completely lifted the dress code. There's no dress code here at Faith. How free would you feel to deviate from what you perceive to be the expectation of the group? Some of you would say, man, I'd have my shorts and flip-flops on in 15 minutes. Others of you would probably say, I'm going to walk circumspectly. I'm going to be really cautious and observe. Okay, so that's kind of the principle we're talking about. You don't have a rule behind you saying it has to be this way. So how do cultures normally act when there's not a constraint placed on something? Okay? Interesting. So restraint versus indulgence. And this, again, is not in your notes. I have added some things, and someday I need to probably get them in, but just write them somewhere else on the backside. Indulgence stands for a society that allows relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives related to enjoying life and having fun. Now, you can take that a lot of ways, but that's the concept of and understand too that indulgence is not always a negative thing. When you hear the word indulge, you probably tend to think of sinful practices like gluttony, and or unrestrained words or things like that. But indulgence as a concept is not bad. Okay, it's how you apply it. Restraint stands for a society that suppresses gratification of needs and regulates it by means of strict social norms. Now notice, they didn't use the word laws there. It's norms. In other words, the society itself, the group, kind of establishes the way things are done. You just don't do that. And if somebody says, well, why don't you do that? Are you not allowed to? No, we just don't do that. The group has kind of created that mentality of what you do and what you don't. Can you think of any context in our society where that type of thing happens, where there's not a specific law or rule about something, but the group that you're a part of is kind of created a standard, an unwritten standard? Can you think of any context like that? When was the last time you went out to eat? You sit down at a table and the food is served. Is there a rule about which utensil you use? I mean, is there even a rule that says you have to use the utensil? No, there's not. Is there any rule that says how fast or how slow you eat? Or is there any rule in the restaurant that says, please do not speak with your mouth full? No, there's not. So how do you know? Maybe some of you don't. I don't know. How do you know? I confess I eat way too fast, and I do tend to talk with my mouth full. So I've broken several of these rules. But there are certain parameters that you function within in a restaurant because the society has kind of created that custom. No rules, no laws. You just kind of picked it up along the way. Does any other come to mind? That's just one example. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Interesting. I embarrassed myself once breaking that norm. I was home on furlough. I was with a family, and we sat down and we started dishing up our plate. And I started eating, and all of a sudden I noticed that everybody else was waiting for the others to finish dishing up their plates. And I felt about that big. I really felt embarrassed. And I didn't say anything because it was only complicated, but I stopped and didn't eat any more until they had all finished. Yeah. Anybody else can think of a context where that type of thing happens? No rules or laws, but the ambiance or the occasion kind of dictates what you do or don't do. Go to a ball game, you're in the stands. How do you dress? How free can you be with your words? Probably a much looser standard in the grandstands than there would be at a restaurant, right? Just because the culture has kind of created that way of composing yourself. All right. Anyway, that's the idea. Let's move on. Now, this is in the notes. Number 2, tight cultures. There are strict rules. So the first blank is tight, then there are strict rules, norms, and standards for correct behavior. Now, I just said that there aren't rules, but I'm using the word rules here loosely. In other words, even though they might not be written in a code of law, the people understand them as rules. They act as if those rules actually exist. We sometimes call them unwritten rules. Okay. Whoops, what in the world? AA? Maybe it's my eyes. Am I seeing double or are there really 2 A's there? Yeah, that's weird. Sometimes religion is a big factor. I mean, and maybe you heard your parents say this when you're growing up, you grew up in a Christian home. Dad, why can't I? We just don't do that. You know, Mom, can I? No, why not? We don't do that. And sometimes people don't even feel a need to explain why. They just say we don't because that's the way Christians are or whatever. Sometimes it is due more to rules of proper etiquette. All right, and then, okay, number 3, loose cultures. There is a strong emphasis on welcoming diversity of cultures and perspectives. In the Netherlands, apparently he stands out as one of the ones that is most welcoming of diversity. Okay, been there? You noticed that when you were there? Do you remember anything specific that you could mention about that, or? Okay. 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 So yeah, the moral aspect came out, and probably on signage too, and things like that, billboards and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And some of that, the more you're in the flat world where the tourists are, the less you'll see that blatant expression. But when you get back where tourism isn't such a big deal, you tend to see things more yeah, the way they really are. Okay. And I've heard that. So I've only flown into Amsterdam. I've never visited in the city itself, only in the airport. You're not going to catch that in a flat world airport. All right, good. Thanks for sharing that. For many, let me here, be aware that sometimes a tight culture will manifest characteristics that may make it appear to be loose and vice versa. For many Japanese, getting drunk is a way to relax and escape the pressures of a tight society. There are even norms allowing for periods of drunkenness. Now, I have been told, and I'm not sure about this, but I've been told that the super high pressure work ethic in Japan has been modified in the last, in recent years, because the suicide rate was high and this sort of thing was just, I mean, if you didn't get drunk, you would basically snap. And so I've been told that the Japanese have noticed that and they've backed off on some of that high pressure lifestyle in the workplace. And I hope that's true. All right. Okay. Tight versus loose is a more recent categorization. This is, number 4. Okay. Letter A, it refers to how strong social norms are and how you handle people who deviate from norms. And we've already made that observation. 2, it can be compared somewhat with the cultural dimension of risk, low versus high uncertainty avoidance. Okay, in fact, I would call attention to that on this slide. In fact, we haven't done this a lot in this class. I would encourage you in the future when you're studying this sort of thing, try to, consider the other dimensions in relation to the one that you happen to be considering. It's interesting. Okay. For instance, let me just ask you, in terms of tight and loose social norms, If you are in a country with very loose, it's very indulgent, would that tend to be more individualistic or collectivistic? The more indulgent norm. The free or the less restrictive. Yeah, let the person express himself or herself. How about high or low power distance? Does that factor in? I think so as well. Exactly. There's much more freedom in the way a person dresses, even for work, or in relation to the boss and so on. So I do think that would be a tendency. And you can go down each one of those and analyze them. So, okay. Two key components in this. Letter A, strength of the social norms. How easy is it to identify the norms? If you walk into a society, let's say you've never been to before, and immediately something strikes you as a characteristic of that society, whatever that particular thing is, if it's the way people dress, that's probably an indication that that is a tight social norm. But if you, for instance, when it comes to dress, if you're in a location, you're trying to figure out how do these people dress, and you're just seeing every possible version of a dress code out there, then you're dealing with a loose standard when it comes to that. So, be observant. Why does everybody do this or say that or go there? That will help you to see if that's a tight or loose characteristic. B, strength of sanctioning regarding those social norms. To what degree are norms enforced? Can you think of a social norm in the United States that is strictly enforced? I'm not talking about a law per se, but a norm that is simply expected and strongly expected of everybody. Yeah. And that is going to depend somewhat on the state that you're from, but yeah, that's a good one we could discuss. How does strictness and looseness of social norms impact the whole issue of masks? And you see the American people really wrestling with that. We've heard horror stories about churches splitting over that sort of thing. And look, even though it's a sad thing that it happens, there is another side to that coin, and I'm not trying to excuse, I don't think any church should split over masks. But at the same time, it does show that we have encountered something that has become a sort of regulation, having been really used to our freedom in expressing ourselves in public. That makes sense? The Japanese really didn't wrestle with this, because Japanese people and other Asians as well, if they have a cold, they wear a mask. When we were in Japan, we saw people all over the place with masks on. This was way before COVID was ever heard of. And I wondered why. Well, either they have a cold, or maybe they're going to be around somebody who does and they want to protect themselves. And wearing masks was common. I would say as many as 1 out of 10 people I saw in Japan were wearing a mask. So when COVID happened, it really wasn't a big issue for them to put masks on, because they were used to seeing it in public all the time. We weren't. And so even though I'm very much opposed to it becoming a church splitting issue, I do at least appreciate part of the struggle, because we've been so indulgent and relaxed in our social norms. That makes sense? It is a challenge. That's good. Any other one come to your mind? Not a law or a rule, but it is a strict social norm expected of people. What about the singing of the national anthem at a ball game? Now, that one's been challenged. Why has it become such a big deal? Because even though it's never been a law, Americans have historically always stood at attention and respect for the American flag during the national anthem. And now, you've seen, and that may be passing a little bit. I don't know. I don't want to speak prophetically, but it doesn't seem like it's quite as hot and heavy as it was a year or two ago. We may not have seen the end of it yet. I don't know. Okay. The whole thing with Black Lives Matter, with the LGBT movement, LGBT plus movement, they all are related to this issue of tight versus loose norms in our culture. And what has been expected and what hasn't been. Interesting. So if you're ministering in a place, this is something you need to take into consideration. What causes, let me see. All right. Yeah, there was a clip here I was going to show you. Let me just double check and see if this has come back. No, there's no internet. So it's an interesting clip just comparing Saudi Arabia, the capital of Saudi Arabia, with New York City. And that's little number one there, comparing Jeddah, Saudi Arabia with New York or London. And it's basically just showing that if you go to a place like New York or London, you can see all kinds of cultural norms exhibited right next to each other. And you can have a gay bar on the same block you have a church, and so on. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, you won't see that type of thing happen. In fact, Saudi Arabia is considered to be the tightest of the cultures on the spectrum. Most people agree that Saudi Arabia is probably the tightest. Okay? So anyway, that clip was about that. It was interesting. Number two, it's not just a question of what is traditional versus what is contemporary. I don't think I have one for this. Let's see. Yeah, I'll come back to this later. Okay, so number two, it's not just a question of what is traditional versus what is contemporary. The reason that something is a tight norm may be because of tradition, but not necessarily. For example, number one, the Pueblo Indians, southeast, western Colorado? It's southern Colorado. The Pueblo Indians are very traditional and allow for almost no variation. There's a case where tradition kind of sets the pace, makes the rule. But number two, the Finns, F-I-N-S from Finland, the Finns, and Thais, T-H-A-I-S from Thailand, who are also traditional, are both loose cultures. So both the Pueblos and the Finns and Thais are traditional peoples, and yet the Pueblos are very tight and the Finns and Thais are very loose. Why? Well, I don't know so much about the Finns, but part of the issue in Thailand is that Thailand is one of the most popular tourist places in the whole world. And everybody been to Thailand? You been there? Very long, or just passing through, or? Okay. So I don't know where you were, how your visit went, but I just know that a lot of people really love Thailand. They cater to tourism. It's a huge industry in their country. So it stands to reason economically that a country like Thailand would be a little looser, even though they're very traditional, because it's big income for them. So they have forced themselves to loosen up a little bit for the sake of the tourist industry. Yeah, and I don't know about the Finns so much, where that might come in. All right. All righty. Let's see. Okay, yeah, number 6 is what causes a culture to be tight or loose? Well, the degree of isolation does play a role. The Japanese, for many, many years, were considered an isolated island nation. They didn't really have much contact with the West until the Second World War. And all of a sudden, they were introduced to a culture that was really foreign to most of them. I think I've shared this with you before. One of the times I was in Japan, I talked to a lady there who said, she was American, but she was married to a Japanese. And she said that even today, many Japanese are suffering from an identity crisis that's still connected to the end of World War II and what happened. So it's not something that's completely washed out even now. And it's because they didn't have that contact with the rest of the world that they did before. So that is a factor, excuse me. And then population density is another one. Do you think that the more dense a society is, the more tight or the more loose they will tend to be? The denser the population. What do you think? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yes, you're right. Many times it's a question of control. When you have high density, the issue of security risk comes into play, and therefore many times the rules are tighter, the norms are tighter for people. Now that's not always the case. For instance, you take New York City, it's very dense, but it's also multi-ethnic to the max. So the situation there is going to be different than in a city where the ethnicity is fairly consistent and you have a high density. Yeah, I think you're right. And again, we got to be careful not to be stereotypical, but I think that's the tendency. All right, number 7. Oh, before that, before clothing, let me number 7. An example of each type. The Taliban in Afghanistan is one of the most extreme cases of a tight culture. Now we said Saudi Arabia, but here we're talking about a specific sector in Afghanistan, not the whole country, but the Taliban in particular. Okay, one of the most extreme cases of a tight culture. B, Thailand is one of the most extreme cases of a loose culture, and again, probably because of the tourist industry. And this is probably a little inaccurate, the U.S. falls somewhere in the middle. Again, we like to put ourselves in the balance, say we're the balanced country. So, you know, that may be a little bit ethnocentric. All right, clothing. Let's talk about clothing. All right. And number 8, clothing is a good indicator of tightness or looseness. And again, please understand, I'm not talking about tight clothing, but tight norms about clothing, okay? So, do people wear the same type of clothing? Any of you been to a country where you saw that? You get off and you saw that people are basically dressed the same? Where at? In India, okay? Now, one of the questions we have to ask is the tightness, actually they dress loosely, but is the tightness of the norm religious? Is it political? Is it because of the climate? What caused it? In other words, you can't just assume that everybody is dressed the same way because of ... Okay, so what would you say? Just I'm gonna put you on the spot. When you see that in India, do you sense that it's because of a religious thing? Is it more because of the climate, or is there something else? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Modesty is a big deal in the Indian culture, and that does relate to the religious system, right? But climate is also a factor, obviously. The loose, long, protecting from the sun is a matter of climate as well. In fact, when I remember when I spoke at a conference in India, they took me out and bought me uh, um, some apparel for that was appropriate. I've never been so comfortable in all my life. The shirt and the pants, I almost felt like I was wearing pajama bottoms just because it was cottony and light and it breathed. And I thought, man, this is so nice. And yet it was considered formal for me to preach. It was white, and same thing on top, cotton, but it breathed. I never really felt hot and sweaty, even though I was, they were long sleeves. So that does enter the picture as well. Anybody else been to a country where you noticed tight clothing norms? Okay. Ah. Uh-huh. So the skirt communicates their location. That's interesting. That's interesting. We do, sometimes we'll do that sort of thing here, but really not as much. In other words, if I come on a casual day with a Denver Broncos shirt on, okay, it's because my brother lives in Denver and he always brings something to us when he comes to visit. And so I wear a Denver Broncos shirt because I got it for free from my brother. I'm not I'm not against the Broncos, but and I'll do that. I have a Detroit Tigers baseball cap. My brother, he bought us authentic player caps. What are you looking at like that? Oh, you're not a Tigers fan. I'm not a Tigers fan either, but hey, it's a free cap and I wear it and it doesn't bother me. So we do that sort of thing here, and people, oh, you're a Tigers fan. No, not really, just got a free cap. And you hear people say that sort of thing all the time. All right, interesting. Okay, thanks, Olivia. Thanks again for your good presentation. All right, let's, letter B, this is true nationally, but also in organizations such as companies. Now, has any of you ever worked for a company that had a very strict dress code? When you go to work, anybody work in a bank? My daughter-in-law worked in a bank for a while, and she was not allowed to wear open-toed shoes, the skirts, even the nail polish was limited, your nails. I mean, and these aren't, this is a bank, it's all about image, obviously, okay? All right. Go to PDI, anybody work for PDI? Yeah. Well, steel-toed shoes about as far as it goes with dress code, right? So I want to ask you to help me out here. What would you consider to be, here's what I want you to do, just write it down or mentally make a note. What would you consider to be the 5 countries that have the strictest dress codes? Now, we've already talked a little bit, but just think about it for a second. Countries that you think would be especially tight with their dress codes. Right? So, who has one in mind? Tight. Okay. All right. Middle East, give me, which one would you think would be the strictest? We actually already mentioned it. Yeah. All right, good. Somebody else give me another one. Or you would consider the dress code to be strict. It's okay to guess wrong. Okay, Ukraine. You said your grandfather was a teacher there? What, university professor? Wow, cool. He's the one you were talking to me about? Yeah, that's neat. So they went out and bought him clothes so he would be dressed properly for the job. Interesting. Okay, so even the conservative churches, the women wore head coverings. All right, interesting. Anybody else have a country in mind? Anybody want to say United States? Probably not. What other countries? Actually, I'm going to give you a list of countries that represent, I think, 4 continents. So it's not all in one spot. It's all over the place. All right, let me give you some here, okay? And again, these are opinions based on research, responsible research, but number 5 is France. Yeah, I was kind of surprised at that myself. But I do know that the French have certain ways they do things, and if you don't do them the French way, you can be marginalized real quickly, right, David? All right. You been to France? So would you agree with this assessment about dress? Okay. All right. Yeah, so it's not hard to imagine this. Number 4 was Sudan, North Africa, Islamic nation. So, that's probably a big part of the reason for that. Number 3 is North Korea. Now we bring in Asia. So we got Europe, Africa, and Asia already in the counting here. North Korea, very strict. And in a lot of these countries, too, you'll find that when students go to the public schools, they all wear uniforms. Now, I know of private schools in the States that require certain kinds of uniforms. Not a lot, but some of them do. But I'm talking about public schools. In Japan, that's true as well. The kids, they all have their uniforms. And part of the reason, can you imagine, well, let me, if we already talked about this, please forgive me, but can you guess why countries like this would specify a dress code, a uniform for their public school kids? Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. You got rich kids, poor kids in the same classroom, but because it's a collectivistic culture, social harmony is important, they're wanting to dismiss that image by making everybody dress the same way. Exactly. Yep. Okay. Uganda. Okay, there's another African nation, Muslim, very strict. And number one, Kara, and we've already mentioned Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So, and I'm sure there are others that other people would put in there and say this is just as strict, but at least you get an idea. But notice you've got Middle East, you've got two North Africa, you got Asia, and you got Europe. Interesting. What's missing in this? What continent? North America is missing, and Latin America, South America is missing as well, because those countries tend to be very loose in their standards. Yep. Yep. Okay. Are we heading? Oh, okay. Did I give you the A and B for clothing? Do people wear the same type of clothing, same type? Then B, this is true nationally, but also in organizations such as companies. Yeah, I did mention that. Okay, number 9, are we heading toward a global culture? So do you think that there's going to come a day when there's one global culture? What's this mean? I love the definitiveness of your answer. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay. So another way to ask this is the equality movement in our country something that we can expect to expand and cover the world one of these days, where everybody's same? And another question, just to complicate it more, Kara, is will there be a one world government someday? See, I personally do not believe there will ever be a one world government until Jesus comes back. There will be attempts at it. Antichrist will try, but he's only going to be over Europe. We talked about eschatology in our last class. He's going to have a confederation, probably in Europe, but the Chinese are going to be against him. They have 200 million army from the east. You're going to have the king of the south, which is probably North Africa, coming against him. So, there's going to be constant conflict. There's never going to be a one world government. And I personally don't think there will ever be a one world culture. And I think I mentioned this way back at the very beginning of the semester, maybe our first day of class, that I believe that even in eternity, there may be diversity of cultures on the new earth. I'm not going to die on that hill. Don't quote me on that. But God created man with an incredible diversity in his genetic system for a reason. Not just because he saw the fall coming and he wanted to make way for that. I don't think so. Anyway, just wanted to throw that at you. Well, let me give you a couple thoughts. Tourists may think so based on superficial observation. That's because they interact with people who have been taught how to adapt to foreigners. Okay? So unless you get into the back rural areas of those countries or the inner city, you might not really see what they're like. B, about 1 billion people travel abroad each year, and I think 75% of those are Westerners, something like that, maybe even more. But the vast majority of these 1 billion travelers are Westerners because they have the money to do it. Travel abroad each year, out of over 7 billion, they represent the flat world. Why is it called flat world? Because they treat everybody the same. They've created this kind of cultural thing. And why does it looks Western? Because most of the travelers are Western, so they're going to cater to them. So you land in Amsterdam, or you land in Frankfurt. You say, wow, this isn't so different from the US. Look, well, you haven't seen the real Netherlands or the real Germany. And then letter C, tight cultures are much more predominant than loose cultures. And that's because collectivism is much more predominant than individualism. And these two tend to run side by side. Okay, what could we consider to be a dominant feature of each type? Did I put this just a second? Yeah, dominant feature. Okay, so loose cultures, letter A, free speech. In a loose culture, and think about it, you don't really need free speech law in a tight culture because everybody's expected to conform. But people in a loose culture feel the need to be able to express themselves, not just in the way they dress, but also in what they say. Tight cultures, religious purity is often the driver behind that. Several of these countries we just listed are the 5 were Muslim-dominated cultures, to North Africa and then Saudi Arabia. Okay. Now, this is not in your notes, all right? Who is a good leader? The one who abides by the rules or the one that dares to deviate from the rules? Which is and really there's more than one way of answering that question. If you think about it, you may feel like a little safer with this guy over here because he's predictable. You know he's going to abide by the rules. You know this guy is going to follow the book. But this guy over here may actually get farther with his agenda because he's willing to step out of bounds a little bit. We've seen that sort of thing happening a time or two in our culture, right? And so some people think that actually the better leader is this guy because he has the good ideas and he's not afraid to think outside the box and even act outside the box. So it's interesting. Loose cultures would tend to be more comfortable with this. Tight cultures, no. They want the predictability. They want to know that this guy is going to follow the rules. Anyway, so which way is our country going? Are we tending? Is there any tendency you see to move to one way or the other, or does anybody think that we're heading this way? I don't think so. Nope, just look at how fast things are changing. And it doesn't start with the Constitution, by the way, as you know. It starts with popular thinking, and then it makes its way eventually to the Supreme Court and the Constitution and all that. It always moves in that direction. All right, parenting. Now, this is not in your notes either, but just something I thought was interesting, and I added it. Tight cultures, there's a threat of the enemy. If you're raising kids and you have a tight parenting mentality, you're really cautious of the enemy out there. You know about the world of flesh and the devil. So you want to give them that greenhouse, protected environment where they can start to grow and flourish. And you usually keep a short leash on your kids. You're really cautious. And there's an emphasis on rules. This is what you're going to do. Okay? Nothing wrong with that. Just saying that's the tight side. Then there's the looser side. And again, there are a lot of good things here too. Your emphasis is not so much on the threat of the enemy, but your security in Christ. You're trying to teach your kid you can face the enemy because of who you are in Christ. You want to expose them to the world. You don't want them to be isolated. And so some parents don't like the greenhouse idea because they feel like it's not going to teach their kids to understand the world they live in. And they give them a longer leash, let them experience things a little more. Yes, it's higher risk. Okay? And then the emphasis is more on principles to live by than specific rules. And I think most of us would agree that somewhere in between here is a good place to be. And every one of you, even in parenting, is going to be a little bit different in the way that you approach these. And that's okay. Someone's going to depend on your background, how you were raised, how did your parents do this? how's your church, manage this? So, but this does reflect tight and loose, and high risk and low risk as well. As you can see that blending in. Okay, Old Testament, Israel, tight or loose? The theocratic nation of Israel, tight or loose? What'd you say? Tight. Yep, God was making them a great nation. Notice he mentions it being an understanding people. Happened to my. Okay, the Lord our God, statutes and rules, and these were considered to be good. It would make Israel a wise and understanding people. God would dwell near them, and their concept of a near God was tight rules. The tight rules were associated with God's closeness to them. So that's just, all these statutes, that's what you teach your children. The church seems to be a little different. Less emphasis on rules and more emphasis on principles to live by. So comparing Israel and the church, you have more rules, fewer rules, more principles. But we are also more responsible. We have the Spirit of God dwelling in us and not in the city of Jerusalem and the temple as it was with Israel. All right. Questionable things real quick. Let's see, this is, I've added stuff. Tell you what, let me come back. Let me give you the rest of number 10 here, okay? I'm going to leave this for now. Number 10, what could we consider to be a dominant feature of each type? Letter A is in loose. Did I already give you this? Okay, the C that we're missing. We must be aware of media hype that tends to make certain cultures appear extremely tight or loose. So one of the things to be careful of when you're evaluating a culture is don't put too much stock in what the media says, because they may or may not represent the mainstream of society. All right, number 11, there seems to be a drift in the way tension is expressed between ideologies. It used to be more of an issue of nation versus nation when you talked about ideologies. Now, letter B, it is more an issue of tribalism versus globalism. In other words, how specific ethnicities think and act, not so much about political boundaries, nations. So there's a tendency to think more in terms of that than there is to think of strict political boundaries. All right. Wait, is that 13? Okay. Women in society, it's been traditionally held that the woman's role in society depends on the tightness or looseness of the culture. The tighter the culture, the stricter, the more limited the woman's role has been. The looser the culture, the more liberty she's had, the loose, more functionality. B, however, tight cultures are not necessarily sexist. Norway is not sexist because its norms allowing women to become more active came from the top down, height, power, distance. In other words, it was actually the government of Norway that gave women more involvement in society. So anyway, Norway is quite an interesting study all of its own. C, loose cultures allow and encourage it to happen spontaneously, which can be good and it can be bad. You can see spontaneity being running rampant in our culture, right? We are a loose culture, but because of that, we've got some groups that are just going bananas with it. Then 13, the last one, category width. It's similar to tight versus loose, but more focused on comparing individuals, not entire culture. That's something I'm not going to get into today. Category width is a way of looking at individuals and saying how tight or how loose is that person. Maybe we can take a look at it next time. All right, thanks. Got a few other slides I'll show you next time.